And so it came to pass that in the spring of the year 30 AD, or thereabouts, just outside of Jerusalem, Jesus of Nazareth endured 6 hours of Roman torture. Mocked by the leaders of his own nation, deserted by the people he had helped so much, and flanked by 2 criminals similarly crucified. Over his head, written in 3 languages, hung the taunting title, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Pilate's final hit back at the priests, and shocking statement of truth. As the sun went down, 2 Jews plucked up courage to acquire the body. They interred Jesus in a new sepulchre, belonging to one of them, Joseph of Arimathea. Sealing the entrance with a large stone. With more than a touch of irony, the Jews, having just proclaimed their allegiance to Caesar, went on with the feast of the Passover, which celebrated their deliverance from a ruthless overlord, 1600 years before. But the nation was uneasy. The chief priests and Pharisees in particular were concerned that mischief might still follow. The disciples of Jesus might steal the body and feign a resurrection. They need have had no such fears, since the disillusioned disciples had nothing to gain and everything to lose from such a scheme. Even if such blatant misrepresentation and dishonesty could have appealed to these uneducated Galileans, how were Jesus' followers going to sell a Messiah who died without a fight, condemned as a common criminal by the Romans, and cursed by their own law, to Jews who were looking for another Judas Maccabees, to establish a glorious kingdom of the Jews? The idea was preposterous. And what, furthermore, would the disciples get from their pains? The scorn of the nation, the opposition of the rulers, and, inevitably, condemnation and execution for blasphemy, leaving widows and fatherless children to mourn the pointless loss. Such considerations as these must have occurred to the perceptive leaders, but there were also other factors. Jesus' amazing powers, his unusual exposition of certain difficult Old Testament passages, some enigmatic statements, the earth tremor, and darkening of the sky the previous afternoon, and the rent veil in the temple, all of which suggested a cautious approach, leaving nothing to chance. With Pilate's permission, they set a watch to guard Joseph's tomb day and night. In so doing, they helped ensure the success of the very thing they were trying to prevent. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The guards were reporting that, while they slept, the disciples had stolen the body, and simultaneously a rumor was spreading that Jesus had been resurrected to life and seen by his friends. 50 days later, at the Jewish feast of Pentecost, the term Pentecost comes from the Greek Pentecost, meaning 50th. It refers to the festival celebrated on the 50th day after Passover, also known as the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of 50 Days in rabbinic tradition, which was established to remember the time spent in the wilderness after coming out of Egypt. At this feast, claims were being made that hundreds of witnesses had personally seen the risen Jesus of Nazareth, and that he had ascended to heaven after appearing to them over a period of 6 weeks. At the feast, the Galilean disciples began speaking in foreign languages, and the fisherman, Peter, who had lied his way out of identification with Jesus in his hour of trial, was demonstrating to the multitude of Jews gathered from every corner of the empire that God hath made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom ye crucified. 3,000 were baptized that day into the name of Jesus, the Messiah, to receive salvation from that burden of sin and mortality introduced by man's fall in the beginning. But that was only the start. The Nazarene doctrine, sown into the minds of the multitudes at the feast, began to spread like wildfire, beginning in Jerusalem where, if it could ever be disproved, the strongest evidence should have been available to do so. This was the place and this was the time when, either by producing the body of Jesus, or offering some reasonable explanation for the empty tomb, the Jewish authorities could quench the flames. But in the very shadow of the events and circumstances surrounding the whole affair, they were completely unable to contain it. They tried to suppress the apostles of the new movement with violence and threats, but every blow seemed only to fan the blaze. Christianity, as it came to be known, was here to stay. In spite of all the arguments that have raged back and forth, the empty tomb is an established fact of history. Seen in its true light, it is the greatest fact of all time, the fulcrum upon which absolute truth, faith and hope for all men, Jew and Gentile, must ultimately rest. At one stroke it both demonstrates and stamps as totally genuine the way of escape from death unto life. Let the viewer ponder these things. The resurrection to life of Jesus of Nazareth is the utterly indispensable foundation to these acknowledged facts of history. No other satisfactory explanation can be advanced for the emergence of the doctrine of a crucified Messiah from a nation intellectually and circumstantially constrained to repudiate it. Why should a band of Galilean fishermen, of all people, be the vanguard of such a movement? If they invented the whole story, or even part of it, we are faced with the difficulty of explaining how they could sell the proposition in such a hostile environment yet with such evident success. How a bunch of deceivers could give the world the purest and most sublime teachings it has ever heard, and how they were motivated to give all, including their lives, for what they knew was a fraud. Some who can see the illogical in accusing the apostles of such blatant and harmful fraud have suggested that they were honestly deceived into thinking Jesus had risen. But this alternative defies even the most fertile imagination. How could such down-to-earth practical men be convinced by anything else apart from their actual loving friend appearing to them, eating with them, being touched by them, showing them his wounds? If Jesus had not been dead on the stake and had revived in the tomb, as some claim, then who moved the stone? Would an exhausted man, severely maimed by scourging, unable to carry his stake, tortured for 6 hours nailed to it, supporting himself alternately by the nail through his feet and the nail through his hands, as his body fought for breath against searing pain and asphyxiation? Water and blood streaming from the spear thrust through his side, as he slumped motionless before the onlookers, pronounced dead by Roman soldiers, used to recognizing a corpse for what it was. Be likely to revive in a tomb and engineer his escape? And would disappointed and disillusioned disciples be convinced of a glorious resurrection if they saw their master in such a condition? The answers are obvious. But the broader question of how the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus could originate from Judea at that particular time and in those particular circumstances equally, if not more so, defies explanation on any other ground except that of authenticity. Those circumstances, the background to which has been reviewed in previous videos, powerfully constrained Israel to look for a conquering Messiah. The ruthless suppression by the Romans of the freedom they had longed for under the Seleucid Greeks and at last tasted under the Maccabees had produced an intense national desire for a military leader of courage, skill, and power. Moreover, from the Jews' point of view, the prophets of the Hebrew scripture seem to encourage the expectation of just such a Messiah. The appearance of a suffering Messiah, leading them to victory over sin, while submitting to the Romans, and postponing the liberation of the nation from oppression, was totally foreign to their thoughts. Furthermore, the greater respect for their law, induced by their earlier sufferings and captivity, resulted in a strengthening of the conviction that anyone hanged upon a tree was accursed of God. Thus a crucified Messiah was, to the nation, a contradiction in terms, an utter impossibility to be instantly dismissed as absurd. Yet the teaching of such a Messiah not only arose in those circumstances, it erupted with irresistible energy and force. Wherein lay the cause? Certainly not in the prevailing conditions, for these all pointed in the opposite direction. It had to lie in factual events, such as those we have traced, events so incontrovertible and compelling that multitudes of Jews, initially of entirely different persuasion, were voluntarily constrained to reorient their thinking and joyfully defy the strongest tides of national and universal opinion. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to get notifications of new videos. Like, share and comment below.